Welcome, thank you for coming in this miserable day and facing the weather and coming to Sam Alexander to hear our speakers. My name is Professor Amanda Bamford. I'm the University Lead for Sustainability. And hopefully today we'll learn something about zero carbon, how the Manchester City Football Club and the University of Manchester are working towards zero carbon in 2038. So today's topic is called Zero Carbon and Meeting Manchester's Climate Change Target of Zero Carbon by 2038. Our two speakers today, thank you for coming. We've got Pete Bradshaw, who's the Head of Sustainability at Manchester City Football Club. We also have Dr. John Broderick, who's a lecturer in energy and climate change at the University of Manchester. So the plan for today, we have the two speakers. Pete's going to speak first, and then John, and then we're going to have the questions and answers at the end. Okay, so if you've got any questions, if you could save them to the end of the session. So with no further ado, we'll start. I'd like to invite Pete to start. He's going to talk about Manchester Football Club, its sustainability agenda, including its climate change and action towards net zero. Interestingly, I noticed the club has framed a lot of its work for sustainability around the UN Sustainability Development Goals, and I know at the university we've been doing a similar, so I'll be really interested to see Pete's views on the sustainability goals as well. So without further ado, Pete.
Thank you. And thank you for the invite this afternoon. What I'll do for the next 20 minutes is take you through a presentation that is based on the football club's sustainability action plan. And what we've tried to do is think about where we've come from, where we exist within the city, what the big issues are, both for us as an organisation, for the neighbourhood we live in, for the city and the region in its widest sense. And we've also tried to apply that across the City Football Group, which is a number of football clubs in different parts of the world. And you're quite right, what we've tried to do is think about Manchester 2038 and how we get there and what does that really mean, and the Sustainable Development Goals and how relevant they are and what can we do to try and support and achieve those things. So I am Pete Bradshaw and I'm Head of Sustainability at Manchester City, and my role is to influence operations and design development, the way the club behaves and is seen to behave amongst the community and within the industry, but also to influence the clubs within the City Football Group. Wrong way. There we go. So our chairman and owner bought Manchester City just over 10 years ago and made a very clear statement and an ambition that everything that we do at the football club, whether it's playing the game on the field or the way we work in the community and operate and develop our facilities, will be sustainable. It's been an ambition for the last 12 years or so in the existing ownership, but importantly, Manchester City was formed 126 years ago this year, and we grew out of a community project. We didn't come from industry, we didn't come from a commercial sector. It was a community project to keep young people out of trouble and at the time away from the demon drink. That's why the club was formed, and that community spirit and that importance is as central to our work today as it was 126 years ago. So 1894 we became Manchester City Football Club, formed in West Gorton, just a mile from where the stadium is now, moved to Moss Side, probably a mile from where we're standing now, to the south of us, and then back to East Manchester in 2003. And the idea was to bring people together, to create community, to use football as a way of uniting the city. And when the club was founded by the Connell family, the idea then was to create a new football club for Manchester. Originally it was a cricket club, it became a football club in 1880. So that's the history, if you like. And as we move forward and look at where we are today, we're one of 8 clubs in the City Football Group, all centred here in Manchester. The clubs have grown from Manchester City, so New York, Melbourne, Yokohama, Montevideo, Girona, I can't pronounce the town in China, so China, and also Mumbai. So that's where we have football clubs right now. The ambition is to grow a little bit further, but as and when is appropriate, and we have academies and offices and footprints in different parts of the world too. The approach we take here in Manchester to sustainability, to neighbourhood and community is just as important wherever we have a footprint in the rest of the world. So whatever we're doing here in Manchester, we have people in all of these places taking exactly the same approach. And when we start to look at what's important to us in terms of sustainability, we're now working, for the first time this year, we're working to triple bottom line budgets. So right at the front of that, and absolutely number one at the front of that, is the social value that we can create from the work we do on the pitch and off the pitch. And this is an example of the last full year where we recorded our social value impact. And that's looking at things like local procurement, you know, and where do our suppliers get their supplies from? Do they employ local people? Is there credibility in their supply chain? It's about local employment. You know, let's make sure that whether it's through the universities and colleges or from community, that we can create jobs and pathways and scope for particularly, but not entirely, young people to come and work within the organisation in a whole range of disciplines. So we target a minimum 70% local employment and 86% local procurement. So that is what we're achieving, and when we spend money and invest in what we're doing, then the vast majority of that investment takes place here within Manchester, and what we roughly call Manchester for employment and procurement purposes is within and around the M60 corridor. So you can see some of the impact. This was measured by New Economy of spending locally, of employing local people, and the change that you can make in terms of neighbourhoods and communities, new pathways to investment, improved health and well-being, and a whole range of issues that are measurable. And some of this is about the look and the feel, and for example, building City Football Academy, £270 million project, of which 86% was spent in Manchester, and planting 2,000 trees, creating new wildlife habitats. That's regenerative for the whole side of East Manchester, and we're now seeing investment coming in from different investors to back that up. So the social value is front and centre of everything we do. And working with City in the community, we outreach to about 35,000 people in and around the city every single year with a community outreach programme, and you can see some of the headlines there with the themes of health, education and inclusion, and something like a new education pathway programme with 500 young people on it, on a pathway to a degree programme with Manchester Metropolitan University. In terms of procurement, then what we've got to do is be absolutely responsible in the approach we take. Yes, best value and being commercially sound is a foundation to everything we do in procurement, but when we've done that, we can do that in a responsible way, in a caring way, in a way that really thinks about where do products come from, what's the lifespan of those products. If we say we want to build a building, you know, and use steel and glass and cement and so on, you know, how much of the content of that is recycled and reused materials, and is that credible? You know, how do we provide energy and ventilation and water for our buildings and so on? All of those things are important, just as it is about where does our clothing and foods and all the other supplies, consumables and things we use come from. It's about being responsible, and it's about being caring and forward thinking. So the statement very clearly is social, environment and economic planning is absolutely central to everything we do as a football club. We have to be commercially successful. We're a commercial organisation at the end of the day, but we can do that in a responsible and caring way. And as part of this, we're absolutely and totally committed and signed up to Manchester 2038. We're one of the founding members of the Climate Change Board, and we've also committed publicly to the whole 17 goals of the UN SDGs. To do that, we developed 8 action groups within the football club. You can see the titles there, from energy to sustainable development to accreditation and biodiversity and so on. And what I've tried to do, I'm not sure I've got it always right, is to apply the different development goals to each of those groups. And those themes are made up of about 10 to 12 people from across the business, not specialists in those fields, they're just people with enthusiasm, people that care, people that want to see change, people that will challenge what we're doing. And those working groups are doing incredible stuff right now, and I'll just share some of those bits and pieces with you. I know I don't expect you to read all of that, because this was just what the UN asked us to do, was to look at all of the individual things, from sustainable cities to gender equality to education, and try and in one sentence say what would the club's response be to each of those. I'm quite happy that this is shared later on so you can actually read it. And then some of the actions we've taken is try to think about how we operate and how we act as a business. And I'm sorry about the drawing. I did this drawing on PowerPoint, so it's just so this is City Football Academy on a rainy day. And what we did is we tried to think about the materials we've used in the building, the landscape, the energy provision, and all the different things in the building. And this one in particular was focusing on the reuse of water, because you may have even today noticed it rains every so often in Manchester. And what we did whilst we were building our football pitches is put an 8 million litre rainwater harvesting tank under the pitches, so we can reuse all the water for watering pitches, for flushing toilets and so on, and it continually recycles and constantly does that. One of the interesting things that happened there about 2 years ago, we had I know you might not believe it, but we had a sunny dry spell in Manchester for about 7 or 8 weeks. And the tank ran dry. We never expected it to, but it ran dry. So we had to go on to mains water for 6 weeks. And when we annualised the cost of that water from the mains over a year, obviously, it was about £500,000 worth of water we would be using for watering football pitches. To operate the rainwater harvesting tank cost me £31,000 a year, and it's constantly reusing the same water. It paid for itself in 4 months. So good quality, sustainable provision paying for itself, so it hits the economic targets as well as the environmental targets. And we have drinking water borehole, so we're totally self-sufficient in the world of water. And at the stadium, we don't have one yet, but we're about to put an 8 million litre tank under the stadium and cover our roofs, car park canopies, and lots of our buildings in PV over the next 12 months. Our aim is by the end of next season to be totally self-sufficient for energy and for water, and be the first stadium in the world to operate all its football matches and concerts entirely powered by daylight. So, planting a first tree. If anybody's local and from Manchester, the site of the City Football Academy used to be a chemical works. You may well remember it, Clayton aniline, poisonous, dreadful. Even the rats left the place alone. It was awful. And if these animals had flown over it several miles high, they would have died. It's now thriving. We've got, I don't know how they count bees, but we've got a bee population of 170,000. We've got bats, we've got invertebrates. That was the first tree that we planted, the first of 2,000 mature trees. And what we're seeing is animals returning in their own right to our site. So last year we've got water voles on the site. We've got 7 acres of wildflower meadow, 9 kilometres of hedgerow full of wildlife. That's important to us because, one, it's part of our mitigation. 2, it actually improves the regeneration of the local area, and it just makes it a really nice place to live, work and play. And all those things are important. And yes, this costs us money, but actually the mitigation saves us money in CRC taxation. So this also earns its keep as well. So it's good to do. And some of the big challenges as we move forward, the Etihad campus is ever growing. We're about to invest in another 2 million square feet of development over the next 5 to 6 years. So we'll see lots more things happening there. already in partnership with the City Council and Sport England, we've got some of the best sports facilities on the planet, the greatest concentration of national sports centres and governing bodies in the UK, and all of them now taking part in the long-term sustainability vision. And some of our challenges, water and energy, I've talked about. Transport, by far the biggest challenge I've got, which I'll come to in a second. Food, we now have really reduced our food waste to as minimum as we can. We're into seasonal foods throughout the year. We're trialling an anaerobic digester that takes both food and grass where we can't avoid waste, and that creates both compost, grey water and energy. We're taking a materials first approach to our buildings and facilities, and the example at the bottom, we worked with a partner, Xylem, one of our key partners, who last year helped us take rainwater off the roof with the Heineken brewery in Moss Side, and we brewed a beer called Reigning Champions, and that was an example of what you can do with water and actually how you engage with fans and people to help share the message. Quickly on environmental impact, what I've tried to do, we've been reporting our impact for the last 17 years, and what I've tried to do over the last couple of years is really think about embedded carbon and scopes 1, 2 and 3. And whereas 17 years ago I was measuring 2 or 3 things and the report was this big, we have become better at it. We're now measuring this much stuff and the report's massive. It is available, and we are developing a new sustainability web page so that you can actually go into the archives and find out all the figures over the last 17 years or so. But some of the things we measure in have covered them: travel, fans, my travel here, my travel to work, all our business travel, our player travel, hotel accommodation, baggage handling, the food people, all measured. Every bit of it measured, and we used to measure it only in scope 1, but now we try and separate it a little bit. So that's what we're doing. This is, you know what CO2 is, you wouldn't be here if you didn't. One of the examples of this is that when we look at our CO2, our stadium, which actually really is only operational 30 days a year, takes up 71% of all our energy consumption. So it's sort of ridiculous in a way, whereas the other buildings take up a lot less. And what we've tried to do in that sense is work with our energy partners and look at how do we use energy? Where is the wastage? What is fugitive energy? So stuff that's peaking at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, there's nobody in the buildings. Buildings are empty. I mean, you've got peak energy being used at 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. It's waste, and if we turned it off, the business wouldn't suffer. Wouldn't suffer. We just need to get smarter. And if you want to know what that means in real terms, it's about £500,000 a year of waste. And I can do a lot in my budgets with £500,000 a year, I can assure you. So this is the sort of stuff we're looking at and playing with and trying to change, and we are changing it. And what this all gives us is a carbon footprint, and this is just behind this, there's tons of stuff of how we measured all of this. So from our matchday operations, our CO2 footprint, to materials, to biodiversity, the construction work we've been doing in the last full year, what was the embedded, what was scope 1, 2 and 3 and so on. We looked at the mitigation, and eventually got a total of 23,500 tonnes that we can't cope with, and if you like. And through the Environment Agency we get a carbon value budget, which for us is £18.30 per tonne, and that means we've got a problem there of £330,000 that we need to deal with in terms of a carbon budget. So that's what we measure in, and sort of the headlines of what's there, and behind it is a whole load of information as to how. And one of the questions we kept getting asked by universities, by our community, by the FA and others was, what's the carbon footprint of a match day? And nobody had one. Nobody could tell us what they'd done. So we tried to do it, and in fairness, this was verified by Manchester Met to tell us whether we'd done it right or not, and they tell me that we got it right, so blame them if not. And what that gave us was this. So when we looked at how people travel to the match by trains and plane and on bicycles and different things, we got an average of the carbon footprint that's created on a match day. And some of them are estimates, because I clearly don't know how old somebody's car is, and if whether there's 3 or 4 people in the car, and if they've stopped off somewhere on the way, we've assumed they've not. We looked at energy use and waste and programme printing and all the things that you would associate with a typical match day or a concert. And what it gave us was 77 tonnes of carbon produced on a match day and just short of 90 tonnes on a concert day. So it was the first time we really were able to measure the impact we have on a match day in terms of carbon footprinting, let alone the noise and the disruption and the congestion and everything that goes with it. So that's sort of the journey we're on, is looking at this and how to make this even better, even more sophisticated, and actually advise us and help us to try and figure out what the hell to do about it and reduce some of these things, but in a way that doesn't negatively impact on the business, if you like, and on the purpose of us being there. And we're absolutely convinced that by and large, most of the actions we take in terms of reducing our carbon footprint, in thinking about social values, in thinking about the impact we have on the environment generally, most of that, if not all of it, will have only a positive impact, economic impact, on the operation of our business. So it should make commercial sense if we really think these things out, if we plan for them, if we engage people from right across the business, from our finance people to our IT people to our TV guys and players and everybody else, and say, look, this is why we're doing it, these are the advantages, this is what we can do, and this is the impact you can make. And if I needed proof of that, sponsors, partners, people that want to be involved with the football club are more and more coming from the world of sustainability and positive environments. And we've also got to think about, where do our stakeholders and our fans of the future come from? Because, you know, again, with a commercial hat on, we have to think about, will people vote with their feet, whether they buy a City shirt or a Stockport County shirt or a Rochdale shirt or whoever else exists in the city, or will they go to some other club that doesn't care? By more and more people are choosing to buy products or support an organisation, go and see a band or whatever it is that actually can demonstrate absolutely clearly that they are caring for the environment and caring for your future and for my future as well. That's what this should be about. That's who we want to be as an organisation, and that's how we're going to try and work in the future. I'll leave it there for now. That's about 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's perfect.
There you go. Thank you very much.
Really amazing talk. Thank you very much, Pete. We'll have questions at the end, so if you've got any burning questions, just save them. I think we're going to move on to John now, who's chair of our Carbon Action Group, and he's going to talk about zero carbon UOM, why, when and how. Thank you, John.
So by way of a bridge to today's weather outside and to Pete in Manchester City, the last time that I was at the City Stadium was to watch Newcastle United beat them in the League Cup. And that's because I'm from Newcastle. And when I was a kid, I got snow every year for my birthday. End of November, Newcastle in the early 80s, snowy. My daughter, growing up now, hardly going to see it, which is really a salutary thought and one that motivates partly why I'm involved with zero carbon work at the university. So why are we interested in zero carbon? Why are we not interested in less carbon? Where does the zero come from? So the reason primarily for this is the fact that CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere. It has a very long lifespan. We have a carbon cycle, but we're currently emitting more CO2 than that carbon cycle can accommodate. And so approximately half of the emissions that we put up today will still be in the atmosphere in 1,000 years' time. And so that means that if we want to stop contributing to further climate change, then we need to at some point reduce our CO2 emissions to zero, or to a point where the amount that we're putting up is being balanced by the amount that we are artificially removing. So this figure here shows the path of annual emissions out through the century for different scenarios run by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change researchers, the IPCC. And what we find is that to keep within the 1.5 degree mean global surface temperature rise target that the Paris Agreement has in place, we need to be looking globally to be getting to zero or net zero by the middle of the century, by 2050. And this is globally. This is not Manchester, which has set itself a 2038 target. This is the global picture. And this also has a slightly awkward message in that lots of these paths that keep us within that 1.5 degree temperature threshold have absolutely heroic quantities of negative emissions in the second half of the century. If we look at the paths that don't, they have a very different shape. So let's take, for instance, this S5 labelled path, where emissions continue in the near term towards 2040 before reducing steeply, and they go very negative. This is the order of the current terrestrial biosphere sink. All of the trees and vegetation in the world sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. We would have to recreate the same again to keep us within that 1.5 degree temperature threshold and have an emissions path that look like S5. The alternative is something that looks like LED. This is the low energy demand scenario that has the smaller dotted lines, where emissions reduce immediately and much more steeply, and there's much less of a requirement for us to artificially take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that is something that the UK has signed up to some extent through this amendment that was one of the last acts of Theresa May in Parliament, which was to amend the 2008 Climate Change Act, which is one of the greatest successes of environmental political lobbying there has ever been. I could give you a whole extra talk or find a Friends of the Earth member to tell you about that. But an amendment of the Climate Change Act to introduce a net zero target that the UK as a whole would be net zero for greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And that was kind of framed by the Committee on Climate Change at the time and echoed by the government as ending our contribution to the problem. The flip of that is that all of the time we're emitting CO2 prior to achieving net zero, we are continuing to contribute to the warming and the increased likelihood of exceeding dangerous thresholds in the climate system. So that's what we have as a national framework. But the end point, which is set by that amendment, and that is all that is changed by that amendment, is not so important as the pathway. So this is something that I emphasise whenever I talk to anyone about plans and actions on zero carbon. Don't just think about your end point, your 0 point, but think about the path that you're going to get there and how steep the reductions that you are going to be making in the near term. So this echoes back to that graph that I showed you of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scenarios. The pathways that don't require you to go into negative emissions to have some carbon sucking apparatus, they have 10 to 15% per annum reductions in them, at least when we have translated them through to developed countries, allowing for some continued growth in emissions in the near term for developing countries to increase their attainment of those sustainable development goals. And so this path is not the path that is currently within UK government targets, but this is something that Manchester as a city has been adopting as a responsible stance on climate change for civic leadership. Now, what matters in terms of the extent of climate change, because of that accumulation in the atmosphere, is the area under the curve. That represents the total quantity of emissions. If you're adding up your annual emissions out through time, you're doing an integration, you're getting the area, that's the total quantity, and that's what determines how much heat is being trapped and how much temperature change we expect. You can draw different paths. And so a linear path could suggest that you would have an earlier zero emissions date, but that would mean that you would have a slightly lower initial reduction rate. But in conversation with my colleagues, we just don't think that that is a plausible implementation path. For the fact that near the very end, if you don't have negative emissions technologies, then you have no space for that long tail of very difficult to tackle emissions, some of which might be safety critical, diesel backup generators, for instance, in hospitals and the like, or any kind of contingency for small releases in the future. And so we've advised, and Manchester City Council has adopted, a path that focuses on rapid near-term reductions, making most of the reductions when you're working on the easy things, when you're finding those big, quick changes like swapping out conventional lighting for LED lighting and the like. So yes, so along with Manchester City Football Club, we as an institution have signed up to support the city in its actions, and this is something that has been welcomed by national government. And we're beginning to work on how we're going to get ourselves there. So I've been chairing the Carbon Action Group, and we've been supporting the estates team to think about, and the whole sustainability team, to think about how we can get ourselves towards that path that Manchester has adopted. So our estimates at the moment for business as usual are that our emissions would not continue to fall substantially from where they have to date. We've had some quite significant reductions, and we're coming up upon a 40% reduction against our baseline. But a lot of that has been to do with decarbonisation of the national grid, closing coal power stations and reducing the emissions that are within the electricity that we consume. So we need to look at what we can do within our building stock, and that's the yellow line on this chart, where we're looking at energy conservation measures. What can we do to retrofit our existing buildings and up their efficiency? And that takes us about halfway there from the work that's been done to date. So how are we going to get to that point further? Well, we need to start looking beyond those kind of physical operations towards our operations, and that's where we're opening things out to the university community to ask everyone to reconsider how they use energy and how they conduct activities that have got carbon emissions implication. So to give you an idea of where those sources would be, our target and the focus of where that planning that has gone before is in gas and electricity. There are scope 1 and 2 emissions. But we also know that our indirect sources of emissions can be quite substantial. And so the blue bars here are for commuter travel and waste on the right-hand side. They're rather substantial, and air travel as well. I've highlighted it in yellow to pick it out to something that we might discuss further, but it's technically a scope 3 emission. The point about scope 3 emissions is that they are indirect. They're not a source where you have burned the fossil fuel directly yourself, but you have a greater degree of influence over some of them than others. And I think that air travel is one of those. It's fundamentally a very energy intensive and currently carbon intensive mode of transport. You cover great distances requiring large volumes of energy to achieve that, and there are not the technical substitutes in the same ways we see for other modes of transport and other energy consuming activities within our daily lives. So a quick thing there. We are going in the wrong direction on this as an institution, and I think it's something that we should be talking about, how we can correct that, how we can talk to colleagues, how we can begin to address this rising demand for kilometres flown. And we also think that there are some ways that we could make reductions in that to bring our footprint down. So we can look at mechanisms for eliminating travel, for reducing the need to travel. And we can think about substitutions for trains, although when we've done analysis, and I'm very grateful to Jen, who I don't see in the room today, for conducting the calculations, there's not a substantial opportunity there for substitution. So we're focusing on, so we're thinking about demand, and we're also thinking about the potential for reductions by switching away from business and first class travel, which has a proportionally much larger impact just because of the simple space that is consumed on a plane, and therefore the fewer passengers and the greater per passenger quantity of emissions for the same journey. Other ideas that we need to be looking at how we would implement, and that we would seek input from the staff community and the student community, is to think about how we plan within the estate, how we would set goals of making sure that all new projects and all new buildings from this point forwards are planned to be zero carbon, because we know that that is the path that we're going towards. We need to do the regular work on upgrading and energy conservation measures, and we also need to be thinking about how ultimately we can take gas out of our buildings, and so move to electrical heating sources or potentially hydrogen, although there's a big question about where the energy for that hydrogen actually comes from. Something that's currently static and hasn't been addressed by our conservation measures is the plug load from us as staff using energy within buildings. And so redoubling our efforts on energy waste is something that, if we're to get on that rapid reduction path, is something we really need, again, all to be talking and thinking about. Because we need to be seeing reductions in the near term to get ourselves on that Manchester-focused path, because the estates project and similar have time lags in the simple delivery of large projects. We need to be thinking about ways of working and reducing travel, and then finally about the possibilities for dietary change in the way we operate catering and for campus events and for our everyday, to bring reductions through the emissions that are embodied within the food we eat. So this isn't an exhaustive or comprehensive set of proposals, but these are the types of issues that we're considering, and that we would be grateful of input from people with an interest and a motivation to help to support this work through the academic year. So yes, happy to take questions. Thank you for your time and attention.
So thank you, John. I think that's a really good place to invite Pete up to the front as well and take some questions. You've given us a lot of challenges that we need to meet as a university and as a city. Before we start, I just wanted Pete, when we were waiting for everyone to arrive, Pete gave us a really good example about your air travel, your trip to New York that was on the cards. Would you like to share? Because you had some good data for that one.
It's sort of the things you've talked about really there, is that we've looked at air travel as well, and why people travel, and you know, a lot of its behaviours, and just you know, we've always done something some way, therefore that's what you must do. And an example recently really was you know, we're developing some projects in New York, so we the idea was that I would go to New York, look at a whole load of plans, sign them off with the architects and the guys in New York, and make sure we did it. And when we looked at it, I said, well, it's interesting, you know, and it's got, I love New York, don't get me wrong, but it's a long journey. The whole cost with the hotels and the airfare and everything was probably about £8,000 when it was all added up, for what would essentially be something like a 3-hour meeting in an office, looking at a screen to sign off a load of plans. I can do that sitting at my desk in Manchester. And what we did, and the carbon footprint, we roughly worked out, when all told, you probably tell me I'm off here, but it was not far short of about 5.5 tonnes of carbon footprint associated with that one action, alongside the cost. And then working with our technology partner, we tried to figure out what was the equivalent carbon footprint and cost of the conference call that subsequently did exactly the same job. And we couldn't measure the carbon footprint. It didn't even hit the scale, and the cost was about 21 pounds. So that's a behaviour thing, and I think the biggest thing we can all look at ourselves, me included, about what are we doing to add to this problem. And I actually told Luke off before, because in this building alone, I wonder how many people can admit to this. You've got a nice rotating door at the main entrance to this building that is actually designed to keep the heat in the building, the cold outside, or the cold in summer, the other way around. But vast majority of people are pressing the button on the disabled door that opens up, and roughly speaking, every time that happens, you have about a 12% loss of your heat or your cold air. So your behaviours, my behaviours, all our behaviours add little by little to the problem. And you know, what else are we doing? We're leaving stuff on. It's all those things.
So
yeah, I think,
interesting.
I think it's behaviour, and including mine, you know, how we change things.
So do we have any questions from the audience? Luke has a microphone, but it won't be projecting your voice, it's just for recording, so can you still speak up so everyone can hear your question? So do we have any questions? Put your hand up. I'm sure there's some. Yeah, there you go, well done, thank you.
I think that technology is the way forward to solve a lot of this problem. 5G is going to help us to not have to move around as much, but when we are moving around, I'd just like to know what us and our partners are doing about, you know, wireless charging for cars, and also being able to just plug in our electric cars. We're going to be going down that route anyway, but at the moment the infrastructure within the university and the city just doesn't seem to be there to encourage us lot to get to, you know, to be able to switch into the more wireless electric type, you know, mode of transport. That's going to really help.
Do you want to do it for the university?
I think electric cars are an awkward one, and I say this as an electric car driver myself. For an urban organisation like our own, they don't solve lots of the major negative impacts of car travel in general. And so I think to emphasise their role in reducing emissions is potentially to excuse their role in social dislocation, when you've got kind of big roads like the Princess Parkway just kind of cutting off neighbourhoods either side. When you've got the accidents that they cause, when you've got the kind of the stress and anxiety and the time costs of congestion. And so I think there's the potential for electric vehicles to provide some reductions in rural areas or in journeys types that can't be facilitated by a dense public transport network. But I think for us as a university and for the City of Manchester, I would emphasise alternative modes of transport, non-personal vehicle transport, as a way of working on this agenda.
And the university's just announced that we're upping our parking fees. I don't know if anyone's seen that, to try and discourage people to bring their cars on campus and to use public transport instead.
I think my response is I'm absolutely at one with whether you drive an electric car, a petrol car or something else powered, it doesn't solve the congestion issue. And I think that's something we need to think about. But in terms of the technology and the opportunity, I mean, I've just bought an electric car, so I've just been told off, haven't I? So we're just working with a partner that's actually trialling wireless charging and actually a unit that actually charges itself from daylight as well. So we're hoping that, again, because again, if you're just plugging it in and drawing the energy from a power station somewhere that comes from fossil fuels, you've still got the same problem. It's just that the problem's somewhere else. So we're working with you know, a sort of PV provider to look at how do you create a really positive experience in terms of car charging, and we're going to trial that probably before the end of this year. And as a fleet, we've gone all electric, and hopefully the next phase is all our mowers and tractors will go electric as well. And we're absolutely encouraging it as much as possible. We're a bums on seats business, you know. When the transport infrastructure, and hopefully some of the announcements that are coming out today will help that, you know, when the public transport infrastructure is really delivering what it needs to deliver in this city and the region, absolutely, let's start moving cars out and providing the options. But businesses at the moment, you know, can't rely on that public transport. And I've got to think of 60,000 fans wanting to get home on a wet Wednesday night in January, not a lovely spring day when they can all walk and it's easy. That's the reality of it, and it's the same when you're leaving lectures or going somewhere or going. You've got to think about how do you cater for that worst case scenario, that people need to be safe and secure, that it's reliable and affordable and all those sorts of things. And we need to do that, by the way. We absolutely need to do it.
But you'd worked on the path from Piccadilly to encourage people to walk, and didn't you have people that were leading people on footpaths to get to the stadium? Jazz band, that was the one. to encourage people to walk.
The aim is by the end of next season to have at least 60% of all people walking to matches and concerts. And we're working with the City Council at the moment to create a brand new parade route, as it'll be called, but a walking route from Etihad campus to the city centre to All Saints to Burley. So there's a linear path that's designed for people to walk, to run, to cycle on, to join up to the new cycleways that hopefully will get announced today. And create that so that, and there's no hiding places, and it's safe and it's well lit and it's smart and interactive, and that's where technology really can help us. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think Emma wants a quick question.
Question for Pete. You talked about influencing, so I wondered where your biggest challenge was and where your surprise open door, if you had.
Did everybody hear that? Yeah.
I don't think this is on.
No, that's not projecting, that's for the thing. So what's your biggest challenge and where your influence is?
The biggest challenge is transport by 1,000,000 miles, and it's for the workforce, it's for people coming to events. You know, when we're trying to recruit people, for example, who rely on public transport, trying to recruit people from, say, South Manchester, Wythenshawe, where they might have to get 3 buses to get to where we are, is an absolute nightmare. And therefore we tend to recruit people from sort of the city centre areas and North and East Manchester when we're trying to be a lot more inclusive than that. So transport in every sense is the biggest challenge we've got. And of course the more successful we are in cup competitions and so on, the more travel we create in terms of fans and players and everybody going to places. So we've got this dilemma of transport and plane journeys, particularly in European matches and stuff like that, that are an absolute nightmare, and I've just got to work so much harder over here to change things. The greatest influence has been working with a big commercial partner, which is Xylem Water, to actually really positively look at what does water mean and how valuable is water, not just here but around the globe, and how can we do something about that. And if you want to see the video of that we did for last season, it's called Closer Than You Think, and you can get it on YouTube, and you can see Sergio and various people that got involved in making that video about water reduction. And what we talked about before we did that was some of the issues we'd seen not far from our Melbourne training ground in Victoria, where we'd seen the Darling River drying up, and saying, look, this is actually on our doorstep. And you know, now you can see what's going on in Australia, and it literally is on the doorstep there. But there's rivers in this country drying up, you know, so we've got
to get those. So do you feel, John, that you have, this sounds very familiar to you, the challenges for the university?
Well, I think we've got more and more diverse infrastructure, and so I think that's a very different challenge. We're not moving people in the same way, although we still do have tens of thousands of people coming onto campus, and so yeah.
Any other questions? We have one at the front, Luke.
Yeah, mine is.
Hold on a sec.
Yeah, mine is a kind of contribution and also sharing the current challenge we are having. It's regarding the hydrogen unknown you mentioned, which is actually how do you really get natural gas out of the buildings and replace it completely with hydrogen. At the University of Salford, we have domestically tested the hydrogen burners for even trying to cook some egg. It takes longer, quite all right, but in terms of challenge, the hydrogen do have a challenge, but it's really looking to be a possible future in the sense that it gives the flame, the energy is coming. We do know that the calorific value of hydrogen is 1/3 of natural gas, but boosting the pressure of hydrogen, at the moment it comes home at 20 millibar. We can increase and triple the pressure coming to homes. We are likely going to solve that problem. We also do have issues of visibility of the hydrogen flame. We are thinking of using colorant to be able to make it visible. So with all those things, having said that, the only thing that we are working towards is getting people involved, because in this zero carbon drive, what we understand that people who are going to be homeowners are kind of isolated. They really don't know much. So we are trying to get them on board so that they will be able to understand if there are cost implications, how do you solve that? And on international level, we are looking at concept of energy poverty, because based on the SDG, if you can get people to have much more kind of better energy sources than?
Yeah, so the role of hydrogen, I have reservations about hydrogen for a number of reasons. So I think that those problems that you identify at the consumption end, at the direct consumer end, are solvable. But to generate that hydrogen, it presupposes an excess of renewable energy if you're going to go down an electrolysis route, or zero carbon energy. You could potentially have nuclear reactors that were designed to support hydrogen production. Or you have a carbon capture and storage system for you to be able to use methane. That presupposes that you have good methane capture in the oil wells and the oil fields and the gas fields that you are taking the methane from. And we know from work here at the university that there is more methane leakage from the fossil fuel industry than we expected, than we have in our present books. So we have multiple problems to solve upstream for hydrogen. I think if we applied ourselves and we put our focus and we put our ingenuity and we put our dollars and cents into reducing the demand for energy in the first place, so increasing the quality of our building stock, increasing the efficiency of our consumption equipment, and decreasing the requirement for heating by, for instance, wearing thicker clothing on a very cold day, changing some kind of cultural norms about that, then we have a set of approaches that are more compatible with that quick set of reductions, that pathway with greater than 10% reductions per year from the get-go, rather than something that has prospects in the medium to long term, but presupposes multiple other problems are also solved.
I've heard similar that we haven't got time to wait around for new innovation, new capture carbon and storage of carbon. We need to start doing things now, and we have a lot of the technology available and the behaviour change available to us now. Question?
Hi, my question's about influence. I guess to a certain extent both of our organisations have people who live kind of high carbon lifestyles, whether that's our leaders at the university or, you know, for example, the players at Manchester City. And I think like that leading by example is a real challenge, and it will help influence other people. And I just wondered if there have been any kind of learnings or plans or proposals that you could share about how either of those groups might be encouraged to kind of promote the really good work that's being done. Maybe it's not a question for one of our academics.
I think there is. Pete, do you want to go?
You go first.
It's always a difficult one. I mean, sometimes you won't see it, but we've got a number of players. We've got some of our senior executives that are driving Nissan Leafs. You know, yeah, it's not in the newspapers. I mean, the Hummers get in the newspapers, don't they? But the guys that are doing the right things don't. But working with Sergio and Bernardo and sort of several of the other players actually on things like how we can share and influence and put messages out about fuel poverty. I think somebody mentioned fuel poverty and how we address that and how we can share some of the issues around fuel poverty, and Vincent, we're looking at food waste and a whole load of things we did last year. We can use players that actually genuinely believe it as well, as long as they do and they're not just doing it because they're told to, and they don't. So we've got players and we've got executives and we've got people in the club and the name of the club that really can make a difference. The other thing I'd say in influencing things, we're working alongside the Premier League and Sky Ocean Rescue, for example, and we became the first football club to totally get rid of single-use plastics last year, so there are none anymore, and we're now slowly but surely getting rid of all PET in the business as well. So by the end of this season, it'll all be gone. Yeah, so and if you can do that and say, well, actually, a football club does, a university, a great organisation is being seen to do things, then why shouldn't I do it? I'll have a go at that, and sport, and particularly football, can sort of make it a bit sexy, I suppose, which is wrong, but that's the reality.
Quick word, and then I think that might have to be running out.
Something a bit less sexy. The research group that I'm a part of is called the Tyndall Centre, and we have partnerships with 3 other major UK universities. And when our last incoming director, a Canadian professor called Corinne Le Carré, who's very eminent in the field of carbon cycles, became the director. She was placed under a lot of pressure from the researchers upwards about the amount of international conference travel that she was doing. And so she systematically planned, measured, calculated, established a kind of a program of reducing her own emissions, and in fact that built into a whole travel policy for the whole research group, and she led from the top with that, and that had very kind of a positive attitude within our little research community. That she would, for instance, prioritise one of her postdoc researchers to go to a conference rather than going directly herself.
So thank you. I'd like to join me thanking our speakers. It's been fascinating. I'm sure we could